Hello, and welcome to our lesson on domestic and global logistics. This segment will cover transportation regulation and deregulation. In the United States, the transportation industry has experienced both regulation and deregulation. Advocates argue that regulation ensures reliable nationwide transportation services, prioritizing safety, liability, and preventing monopoly pricing. Conversely, deregulation is seen as fostering competition, allowing flexible pricing based on supply, demand, and negotiations. Existing antitrust laws aim to safeguard transportation consumers. A 1994 study on the impact of deregulation in the motor carrier industry revealed increased use of cost-of-service pricing, higher freight prices for less than truckload (LTL) shipments, and safety concerns due to aging fleets and reduced maintenance. While the industry is predominantly deregulated today, carriers must still comply with existing regulations. This overview explores the history of transportation regulation and deregulation in the United States. The following slides outline key transportation regulations in the United States, tracing back to the Granger Law of the 1870s. Prior to this, railroads imposed high rates and discriminated against small shippers, prompting Midwestern states to enact laws regulating railroads. These laws aim to set maximum rates, prevent local discrimination, discourage rail mergers for increased competition, and prohibit free passes to public officials. Although later overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court, the Granger movement raised awareness about the effects of railroad monopolies, ultimately culminating in the enactment of the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. The 1887 Interstate Commerce Act mandated rail carriers to charge reasonable rates, publish them with the ICC, and refrain from discriminatory practices. Amendments from 1887 to 1910 empowered the ICC, prohibiting agreements on revenues, enforcing penalties for rate deviations or rebates, setting maximum rates, and restricting railroads from owning water carriers or pipelines without ICC approval. In 1917, due to heightened competition and rate restrictions, the U.S. rail system struggled to efficiently support the government's war efforts. Consequently, the federal government took control of the railroads, ensuring profits for companies and investing significantly in system improvement. Post-World War I, Congress recognized the detrimental impact of strict controls on the industry and sought to return railroads to private ownership. This led to the implementation of positive control regulations, notably the Transportation Act of 1920. The 1920 Act mandated the ICC to ensure railroad rates yielded a fair annual return, initially set at 6%. Excess profits were divided, with half used for low-interest loans to enhance weaker operators' efficiency. The Act empowered the ICC to establish minimum rates, allow joint terminal use, permit rail consolidations, and restrict securities issuance without ICC approval. This regulation aimed to prevent overcapitalization, transforming the rail system into a regulated monopoly. Similar regulations for other transportation modes were enacted from 1935 to 1942. Extensive investment in the U.S. highway system during the 1920s and the Depression set the stage for the rise of for-hire motor carriers. Between 1935 and 1942, small trucking firms flourished, introducing competition as shippers turned to the more affordable for-hire motor carriers. The Motor Carrier Act of 1935 empowered the ICC to regulate motor carriers, oversee market entry, define operational classes, determine reasonable rates, require ICC approval for mergers and acquisitions, and control securities issuance. In 1938, the federal government expanded the ICC to include air carriers under the CAA Civil Aeronautics Act. This legislation aimed to enhance air safety, improve airline efficiency, and establish the Civil Aeronautics Board to oversee market entry, competition levels, regional feeder airlines, and reasonable rates. The CAA was also created to regulate air safety. In 1940, a Transportation Act expanded the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, giving the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, authority over domestic water transportation, mirroring regulations for motor and rail carriers. In 1942, this act was further extended to include freight forwarders, subjecting them to ICC controls on entry, service, and rates, and prohibiting carrier ownership. The 1948 Reed-Bullwinkle Act empowered carrier groups to propose rate changes to the ICC through rate conferences. The 1958 legislation provided temporary loan guarantees for railroads, relaxed intrastate rail rate control, and clarified rate-making distinctions for motor carriers. The Federal Aviation Act of 1958 established the FAA, replacing the Civil Aeronautics Administration, granting authority over air traffic rules, safety regulations, and national airport planning. The 1966 Department of Transportation Act formed the DOT to coordinate government transportation functions for improved planning. Finally, the 1970 Railway Passenger Service Act led to the creation of Amtrak, enhancing passenger rail services. This is the end of this segment of our lesson. In the next segment, we shall discuss the impact of logistics on SCM. This course is presented to you by South Europe College. Thank you for listening, and see you on our next segment.